In our last lecture, we examined the beginning of the American Revolution, the most important and the defining event in the history of liberty in the modern age. We looked at April the 19th, 1775, and the militiamen at Lexington and Concord who fired upon and engaged in battle with troops of the British king on a lawful mission. And we followed the course of that revolt to June the 17th in 1775, when Americans defended Breed's Hill against an onslaught by crack troops. The American Revolution had begun, and as the king would say, the Americans were in open and avowed rebellion. And on July the 3rd, 1775, at the behest of the Continental Congress, George Washington took command of the Continental Army. In this lecture, we want to ask the question, why? For many of these men who stood under the elm tree in Cambridge to receive the salute of George Washington had only 12 years ago been loyal subjects of the British Empire, proud of their role in the defeat of the French in the long 7 years' war, as it was called in Europe, or the French and Indian War in this country, proud of their service, proud of their role in expanding the frontiers of British power. What had served in these intervening years to turn them into rebels, into armed traitors against their king? There are two primary events. The first was the war itself and the British victory. For that victory removed from the Americans the threat of French conquest. And that war also imposed upon the British government a tremendous debt and obligations with Indian tribes in the west of the Alleghenies, as well as the need to maintain frontier posts. The second event was the accession of George III in 1760. He was the third member of the House of Hanover to be king over England. He came to the throne as the result of the Law of Succession passed by Parliament. By this, the kingship would go to the nearest Protestant male relative of the House of Stuart. And George I, who had been the Elector of Hanover, small German principality, was in fact the great-grandson of James I. And when Queen Anne died without heir, he became King of England. Now, George I always remained a German sovereign. He took little interest in the English kingdom and, in fact, didn't even really speak English. He tried to address Parliament from time to time in Latin. That was a total failure. And his son really didn't have much more interest in England. But George III was, as he said, a British king. That in itself suggested how little he understood his subjects. It outraged people. He should have said he was an English king. But he spoke English, and he intended to rule. He lived in an age of benevolent despots, an age in which many, like Voltaire on the continent, believed that the best form of government was an extremely enlightened king who handled all matters well for his subjects, looking back to Plato's ideal king. Men like Frederick the Great or Maria Theresa in Austria, Catherine the Great of Russia, Joseph of Austria. All of these were models. And George III, like them, intended to bring good government to his subjects. He sought to do this by controlling Parliament. He would have to achieve his reforms through Parliament. By an extensive use of patronage, he gained major strength in Parliament and filled up his cabinet with yes-men, men who would do what he said, men chosen for their adaptability rather than for their principles. And like any good benevolent despot, he wanted centralized, efficient control, not only in England itself, but in the far-flung empire, as in India, for example, where various measures were taken to centralize British control, and also in North America, to give it a centralized, efficient government in place of its decentralized, archaic systems of government, with each of the 13 colonies having their own legislative branches with very inefficient rules, such as their controlling the purse strings of the governor's salary, to make them also pay their share of taxes. For this is what they did not do: pay sufficient taxes. They were very lightly taxed, more lightly taxed than the subjects in Britain itself, and there was this war debt. And why should the colonials not pay a reasonable part of this war debt? Well, the Americans viewed George III's attempts at efficient centralized government through two spectacles. The first was Greece and Rome. These were men keenly aware of the lessons of ancient history, and whether they were Harvard men like John Adams or self-educated like Benjamin Franklin, they read the classics and they understood the nature of power. And they understood that power will grow without check until it becomes tyranny. And they saw in George III a potential Caesar, one who sought to level every barrier to the growth of his absolute power, and was testing the Americans step by step as to how much of their liberty he could take away. Now, George III may seem a preposterous Caesar to us today, but to the Americans this was real. Made even more real, perhaps, by George III's pretense of appearing on coins as king by the grace of God and wearing a laurel wreath like a Roman emperor. The second spectacle was the history of England. And as we mentioned in an earlier lecture, the lessons of the English Revolution were very close to the Americans in 1775 and 1776. The lesson that a king could be overthrown, the lesson of Cromwell, and the lesson that the surest test of tyranny is taxation. And it's around this one word, taxation, that the crisis in the American colonies developed. George III said and believed that his main problem with the Americans was that they did not want to pay their share of taxes. It was just that simple. It was about their pocketbook, and liberty was just a pretense. When his ministers made this point in Parliament, the great statesman Edmund Burke contradicted them and pointed out in a powerful speech that the great contests for freedom were, from the earliest times in England, chiefly upon the question of taxing. Most of the contest in the ancient commonwealths turned primarily on the right of election of magistrates, or on the balance among the several orders of the state. The question of money was, not with them, so immediate. But in England, it was otherwise. On this point of taxes, the ablest pens and most eloquent tongues have been exercised. The greatest spirits have acted and suffered. They took infinite pains to inculcate as a fundamental principle that in all monarchies, the people themselves must, in effect, immediately or immediately possess the power of granting their own money, or no shadow of liberty could subsist. The colonies draw from you as with their lifeblood these ideas and principles. Their love of liberty, as with you, is fixed and attached on this specific point of taxing. Liberty might be safe or might be endangered in 20 other particulars without their being much pleased or alarmed. Here, they felt its pulse, and as they found that beat, they thought themselves sick or sound. And Burke would remain one of those members of Parliament who throughout the long contest was a firm supporter of the Americans. In fact, the Americans believed that they were in a different position from the Englishmen in England. They had been sent out as colonists. They had brought with them their traditional rights as Englishmen. They had brought with them their own forms of legislative branches. Already we saw in 1619, Virginia had a House of Legislature. The Mayflower signed a contract, a compact, a written constitution of government. And so from their beginnings, the Americans saw themselves as governing themselves in local issues. And the question of whether they were subject to Parliament at all was, in the American mind, highly debatable. Now, in Parliament, there was no doubt that Parliament ruled for the entire empire. But the Americans came to define increasingly clearly in the late 1760s the idea that they were only bound to England by ties with the crown. They were not represented in Parliament, and hence to tax them without representation was illegal. And that became a rallying cry: no taxation without representation. Parliament answered, but you are represented virtually as every Englishman is represented. We do not have in Parliament geographic representation. Men are elected from all over England to serve particular districts. And, moreover, there are whole towns like Manchester who have no representatives, and yet Parliament legislates for them. And the American response was, well, Manchester should have representatives. And until we are actually represented in Parliament, we should not be taxed. Taxation should be handled by our local legislatures in each of the 13 colonies. And so, that was the theoretical grounds on which the test began. And the test began simply enough and reasonably enough from the British point of view with two proclamations, one in 1763 and one in 1764. The proclamation of 1763 limited settlement beyond the Allegheny Mountains. That is, the whites were not to settle in that area. It was the result of legal treaties signed by the British Crown with the American Indian tribes. Now, these American Indians were subjects of the British Crown. They had rights as well, and the Crown had the obligation to enforce these treaties. But the Americans immediately responded, as they did time and time again, by simply ignoring this proclamation. Instead, they continued to settle on the frontiers and also immediately transformed the motives of the king, making them as sinister as possible. The king did not want these frontier areas settled because he wanted to diminish the love of freedom among his subjects. Those living on the frontier were the hardiest bastions of liberty. And he also wanted simply to harm his subjects, but by denying them the equality of opportunity provided by moving westward. So the king's motives were sinister. And then, in 1764, in order to raise an adequate amount of taxes, the Sugar Act, or Revenue Act, as it was properly called, was decreed. Now, the Americans had long flourished by smuggling. And in particular, they smuggled molasses out of the West Indies. Rum was a staple of the time. Remember, we talked about how our militiamen, before they went out on the green, stopped at the tavern and had a little bit to drink. And the debates of the time were carried out in an alcoholic haze that might astound us today. Men as notable as John Adams liked to begin every day with 2 big mugs of hard cider. And rum was also a staple. And the British West Indies did not produce enough sugarcane to supply the amount of molasses needed by the distilleries of New England. And so it was common to import it from the French West Indies as well, but this was illegal, or at least there were heavy duties upon it. So the notion now was to half the amount of duties, of taxes, put on the importation of rum, put on the importation of molasses, but actually to collect it. For in the past, it simply had not been collected. Now it was going to be collected, and to make sure it was collected, officials, new boats, other customs offices had to be set up. And so the Americans saw in this not just an attempt to collect new taxes, for which they had no representation in Parliament, but secondly, to create a standing force in the colonies subject to the Crown to supervise their commerce and trade. Insidious, small perhaps, but an insidious start. Because also these officials, and custom duties in general, operated under a system of laws, the Admiralty law, that was different from common law and did not provide for jury trials. That was a dangerous precedent. And throughout this, the Americans are keenly aware of any attempt to diminish the right of trial by jury. The same way they are keenly aware of any attempt to increase the power of the Crown or its representative, the governor, over their colonial legislatures. Same time, in the Currency Act of 1764, the colonists were forbidden to issue paper money. Now, this again was striking at small farmers. Then, failing to raise enough revenue, a new tax was put into place in 1765, the Stamp Act. By this, government stamps were put on a wide variety of documents, newspapers, even playing cards. Now, in England, this was common. On the continent, it was common. This was not some unusual form of taxation, but the Americans reacted with violence. Those who were trying to collect the Stamp Act were literally tarred and feathered. Serious resistance and a boycott of British merchants, all to bring pressure upon Parliament to rescind the tax. And it worked. The British merchants sided with the colonials, put pressure upon Parliament, and the Stamp Act was rescinded. But in 1766, Parliament made the legal situation clear. The Declaratory Act declared that Parliament had the right in all instances to legislate for all Englishmen everywhere. Now it could not be clearer that the Americans were subject to the control of Parliament. The Stamp Act had another significant consequence in that, outraged by it, 9 of the colonies sent delegates to attend a Congress, an extra-legal Congress, from the Crown's point of view, to protest the Stamp Act. And they began now increasingly as a unit, the 13 colonies, to oppose the various measures by which the Crown sought to centralize its control. And I think from 1766 onward, the Crown is very determined to centralize its control. The various measures that are passed are not accidental. They have an overriding goal, which is to reduce the colonist to the control of Parliament and the Crown and leave this issue without doubt. The member of the British ministry, the cabinet of King George, Charles Townshend, had a reputation among his colleagues for easy living. They called him Champagne Charlie. He was sardonic in his humor, but he was also a keen student of the colonial problem. And if he felt that the colonials were resisting the Stamp Act because it was what they called a direct tax, then let them pay indirect taxes, which even the colonials admitted had long been collected by the Crown. And so taxes were put on objects such as lead, glass, tea. Well, again, whether they were direct taxes or indirect taxes, taxes passed on to the consumer, the colonists still did not want to pay them. And again, there was reaction to such a degree that Parliament rescinded these acts, leaving only the tax on tea as a symbolic statement that Parliament could tax the colonies. But time and time again, the colonists resisted and Parliament stepped down. creating a dangerous atmosphere in which the Americans believed they could obtain what they wanted by escalating the violence. Now, there had always been tensions between the British regular troops and Americans. Even during the French and Indian War, the Americans, while serving with bravery, felt that they were not given their due regard by the British officers and troops. Indeed, John Adams would later say that one of the causes of the Revolution, he believed, was the contempt with which the British officers treated Americans. In one case, for example, an order was issued that any British officer, regardless of his rank, say a lieutenant, outranked any American in terms of giving an order, even a colonel. So that was the attitude of the British officers, and the attitude of the men towards the Americans was nicely rendered in the song Yankee Doodle Dandy. Yankee Doodle went to town, riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his hat, and called it macaroni. In other words, that's how rude these Americans were. They thought just putting a feather in your hat made you cool. Macaroni, that was the Italian term of the day for someone who thought he was smartly dressed. Well, these tensions increased when some 2,400 British troops were ultimately stationed in Boston, being shifted from frontier posts to the cities out of concern over the escalating violence in the colonies. And these British troops were badly paid and took to moonlighting, finding jobs. And they would work for less wages than the ordinary American because, of course, they got their room and board free. And on this day in March the 5th in 1770, an American had been trying to get a job in a lumber yard, and a British soldier had beaten him out of it, so getting a little upset and talking with some of his friends, perhaps drinking a little bit, they went out that evening looking for trouble. Found a British sentry, began to bait him, throwing snowballs and ice at him, calling him a lobster back. And he called for some of his friends, and the British fired upon the Americans. The Boston Massacre, it was called, and the blood really was shed in the streets of Boston. 5 Americans lay dead, including a black man. Now, such was the outrage in Boston that no Boston attorney dared to defend these British soldiers until, as we've mentioned, John Adams stepped up because he believed everyone should have a fair trial and defended them. For 3 years, same things seemed to be calming down, but the issues were still unresolved. The Americans refusing to accept the legal status of Parliament as their governing body, and increasing tensions over the troops stationed throughout the colonies. And then the British government made a crucial mistake. Like many such mistakes, it was out of a concern for their pocketbooks. Many in the cabinet owned shares in the East India Company. The company was faced with a financial crisis, we would say, the day that it was going to meet its third quarter earnings, and what were they going to do about it? Well, what Parliament decided, goaded by the King's ministry, was to give the East India Company a monopoly on selling tea in the colonies. Now, tea was as much a staple as rum, but as a result of this monopoly, in fact, the price of tea would drop in the colonies. Now, the East India Company would directly merchandise its tea, and this would certainly harm merchants in the colonies, but for the ordinary consumer of tea, it would mean a drop in prices. Tea would cost less in Boston or New York than it cost in London. But again, it was not the cost, it was the principle. And if the Crown could establish monopolies in this one area, they could establish them anywhere they wished. It was again the attempt by the Crown, as the colonists interpreted it, to create precedents which robbed them of their liberty, in this case of their economic liberty. And so, dressed as Indians, December the 16th, 1773, spurred on by Samuel Adams, the greatest firebrand of the Revolution, who shouted that there was nothing left to do by talk. ships carrying the tea of the East India Company were boarded and the tea thrown into Boston Harbor. And this was an assault upon property. It was an assault which lost the colonists the support of British merchants. And this time, a declaration of a boycott of British goods brought no response from British merchants except to urge Parliament to stand firm against rebellious thugs who had assaulted the king's officers, his taxation officers, and now destroyed private property. And from now, the tensions escalate. In order to punish the colonies for this action, King George and Parliament decide upon a policy of divide and conquer to break up the unity of the colonies. Colonies who were sending circular letters supporting one another, despite admonitions by the governors not to, despite even adjourning houses of the legislature in the colonies for sending out these colonial circular letters. In order to divide and conquer the colonies, it is decided to single out Massachusetts. And in 1774, acts which the colonials will call the coercive acts, or the intolerable acts, closed the port of Boston. Secondly, and most ominously, renewing an act going back to the reign of the Tudors, an Englishman in the colonies who is guilty or who is accused of treason against the crown can be brought back to England for trial. A governor, Thomas Gage, is appointed with both civil and military authority. Town meetings, the staple of Massachusetts democracy, are suspended and can only be called with the consent of the governor. And then, from a theoretical point of view, perhaps the most dangerous act in terms of giving a justification for revolution. The Crown interferes with the mode of electing the legislature of Massachusetts. Its upper house is now appointed by the Crown, acting through the governor. In response, the colonists now, from 12 of the colonies, Georgia accepted, send to Philadelphia delegates to form the First Continental Congress. Their alarm is heightened when in the same year of 1774, the Crown passes through Parliament the Quebec Act. Now, it has been said that this was utterly coincidental to what was going on in the 13 other colonies. I don't think so. It was an act which was aimed at regulating the newly conquered area of French Canada. It gave to the French subjects of the king their own law. But that law is Roman law, which the colonists saw as a vehicle for despotism. It expanded the borders of Quebec, pushing deep down to the Ohio River this new form of law. In other words, it was seen by the colonists, and I think rightly, as a precedent to revamp their own legislatures and legal system to make them more adaptable to despotism. It was in this climate that the king's troops marched out to Concord and Lexington and met with the armed resistance from the colonists. Now, on May the 10th, 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened. British troops had already been fired upon, but the colonists determined once more to try to have peaceful relations with the Crown. And what was called an olive branch petition, drafted by John Dickinson, was sent to the king, asking for reconciliation. He refused even to read it. And on the next day after it arrived, he had declared to Parliament that the British colonies in North America were in open and avowed rebellion and placed them outside his protection, ordering to put down this rebellion mercenaries from the continent to wage war, as the colonists saw it, with every savagery imaginable. Still, the ties had not been broken, and declaration of an independence not yet proclaimed. To that we will turn in our next lecture.